Welcome to Hennepin Avenue United Methodist Church. We are delighted that you are here. We live in interesting times. So the solidarity in this place is lifeblood. It is hope. It is good. So I'm so delighted that you are here. We'll just pray a little bit. I'm not a long prayer. And then I'll introduce you to Amanda. And those of you who are seated over here, I'm just telling you, I'm pointing this way. If you want to see the main speaker, don't sit there, you'll see me. So you can move and I won't feel badly at all. Will you pray with me? God, we thank you for the call you have placed on our hearts to feel, even when it hurts. We thank you for the ways we share breath and life and hope and love and despair and laughter and determination. We thank you for the call you have placed on our life to follow in the way of Christ Jesus, who was not still when there was injustice about. So for this time, for the ways we are building a movement person by person, hope by hope, conviction by conviction, we give you thanks. Amen. So I get to share a short bio about Amanda Tyler, who is delightful. She is the executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. She is leading the organization as it upholds the historic Baptist principle of religious liberty, defending the free exercise of religion and protecting against its establishment by government. The author of How to End Christian Nationalism, which is available right outside this door. Tyler is also the co-host of BJC's Respecting Religion podcast. Her constitutional law analysis and advocacy for faith freedom for all have been featured by major news outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS News, ABC News, CNN, and MSNBC. And she has testified before Congress on religious liberty and Christian nationalism. She's a graduate of Georgetown University and the University of Texas School of Law, and she lives in Dallas, Texas, with her husband and her son. And I hope you will join me in welcoming Amanda tonight.
Thank you.
Welcome to Minnesota.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here. I can sense the hospitality, and it really is good to be with you. Thank you.
So maybe what other people are wondering, and certainly I am too, I'm very grateful for your book, and I was grateful to be able to read that. How did this start to live inside of you in such a way that you've given your life so far?
Yeah.
You're not done yet,
No.
but a lot of passion and talent and energy into this issue.
Yeah. Well, and the book is not a memoir, but at the beginning I do tell some of my story about how I got here. And it really started as a 7-year-old when I was baptized in a Baptist church in Austin, Texas, and just how important my faith has been to me all of my years. And at the same time, I had a real calling to a life in law, in government, and politics. And I started sensing that calling as about a 7-year-old, which is a little odd now that I have a 9-year-old myself, that I can see that it was a little unusual. But this idea of how do religion and government relate to one another, it's been living inside me since I was a small child. And because of the way that my path led me to Washington, D.C., I encountered this amazing organization called Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. It's an 88-year-old organization headquartered in Washington, D.C., and our work is all about religious freedom and the separation of church and state. Mm-hmm. And because we are Baptist Christians, most of our advocacy are for people who believe things differently than we do. That's because we are in the majority in this country, and it's not our religious freedom rights that are most at stake. So I worked there as a college student. I did some other things in the meantime, including going to law school, working for a member of Congress, practicing law. But I found my way back to BJC, and I came back in January 2017, 2 weeks before Trump was inaugurated for the first time. And my professional life was very much defined at that point at BJC by a total upending of what religious freedom means in this country. As you all probably recall, a week after Trump's inauguration was the first iteration of the Muslim ban. And then soon after that, it was a vow to repeal the Johnson Amendment and allow political campaigning in all kinds of houses of worship and nonprofits. Then an executive order for the Justice Department to start enforcing religious freedom in new ways. And so it was one thing after another. And then that summer was the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. And the next year was the shooting at Tree of Life Synagogue. And it just became completely obvious to me that the single biggest threat to religious freedom for all people in this country is this ideology of Christian nationalism. And so we, working with our ecumenical allies and with the fullest support and endorsement of our interfaith and secular allies, started the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign. I loved hearing about how Jerry came to know about the campaign, as a lot of people did after January 6th. But we actually started the campaign in 2019. So we had been organizing and helping explain and understand Christian nationalism for 18 months by the time of the insurrection. And so over the last 5 years, I've spent more time than I ever would have imagined learning about Christian nationalism, seeing how it shows up. And the question that kept coming up in all of my public speeches and all of the conversations I had from people were, what can I do? I'm with you. I'm scared by this ideology. I understand it's a distortion of the teachings of Jesus. I'm horrified by the impact it's having on my neighbors, but what can I do? And so that was the impetus to writing this book. This book is meant to say in a very accessible way, both to diagnose the problem, but also to give actionable ideas for someone who is wanting to do something about it. And it just, this book came out on October 22nd. I've been on a book tour now for about 3 weeks. This is my second book event since November 5th. And things have shifted dramatically in our country. And what I hear from other people and what I believe myself is we need people to know what to do, and we need to convince people that now, if ever there was a time to take action, it has to be now.
And so I'm going to ask two questions, at least. Could you just speak to what is Christian nationalism if someone's here for the first time or isn't familiar with the term? Can you just give us a 101, and then I have a follow-up question,
Yes.
too.
So Christian nationalism, as I define it in the book, is a political ideology and a cultural framework that tries to merge American and Christian identities. Put another way, Christian nationalism in the American context suggests that to be a real American, one has to be a Christian. And not just any kind of Christian, probably excludes a lot of people here tonight, but a Christian who holds certain fundamentalist religious beliefs that are in line with certain conservative political priorities. Now note, just to be a fundamentalist Christian, just to have conservative religious beliefs, is not to be someone who embraces Christian nationalism, but rather to say that those are the only people who really belong in this country, that this country was founded by Christians in order to privilege that form of Christianity in law and policy. Those are markers of Christian nationalism. And in the American context, Christian nationalism has significant overlap with white supremacy. And that's because of the ways that our Christian religion and Christian theology has been distorted and used for centuries to justify oppression and marginalization and to prop up a caste structure, a power system that privileges whiteness above everything else. And so to interrogate and to work to dismantle Christian nationalism, we also have to interrogate and understand how white supremacy is layered into that.
Yeah.
So that's my 101.
Thank you.
But I can, and there's more. But
What I'm hungry to have you speak to, and I would suspect others who are here as well, is now what? Given the results of the election, certainly that's foremost in my heart. How are we to certainly organize, but what are you learning as you listen in and network with people about, I won't ask you what happened, but just your thoughts on this most recent election.
Yeah.
And how Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism, may have impacted the results.
yeah, I think we're all asking what happened.
Yeah.
Right? And I will say one thing, and I'm not a political pundit, though I listen to them somewhat, and I have been reflecting. I did have a prior life in politics for 8 years, working for a member of Congress. I worked on political campaigns, so I have an interest and a lens to look at what happened. But what I think happened is we heard from a large majority of Americans, some of whom voted for Trump and some of whom who didn't, who voted for Harris. We heard that our democracy is not working for them. Our economy is not working for them. People are hurting. And they used the greatest power that we have as citizens, and that is their vote in a free and fair election, to let us all know that life in this country is not working for them. And I think we have to listen very well to that voice. I do not think that a majority of Americans are endorsing the hateful rhetoric and the authoritarian policies that Trump has promised to bring into the White House. I do not think that he has a mandate for authoritarianism and hate. And if we are going to move forward, as I think we must, in pushing back against authoritarianism, we cannot equate every person who voted for Trump as being someone who endorses those policies. And so it will be incumbent on all of us to work together across lines of all kinds of difference to push back against authoritarianism. Now, did Christian nationalism play a role in the result? Absolutely. We saw for months and years the language of Christian nationalism being leveraged to divide us within this country, to scapegoat certain Americans. Particularly, I just think it's horrific the way that transgender people in this country were characterized and used to drive fear and misunderstanding in ways that are really reminiscent of a country that's headed on a course to genocide, right? This is the dehumanizing way that countries legitimate killing people within their own country. And that might sound extreme, but that's what we saw in ad after ad after ad that was put on not just by the Trump campaign, but by other candidates across the country. We saw the same kind of dehumanizing rhetoric towards immigrants, including in that closing statement at Madison Square Garden and the horrific speeches that were there. But to take human beings who have fled horrific situations in their country, who made dangerous journeys here for some semblance of a life and hope, and then to be likened to animals as a way to justify what is now going to be this cruel mass deportation policy. This kind of language is preying on the ideology, preying with an E, not an A, preying on the ideology of Christian nationalism that says that there's only certain people really belong here. That the only people who really count as Americans are the people who held power back when this country was founded. Because that's part of this Christian nationalist ideology, is this reliance on the America as a Christian nation narrative. And so that fear, that misunderstanding, that was exploited throughout the campaign. We also saw language that was claiming that Trump was God's chosen candidate, prophecies that said that in the wake of the assassination attempt that God had saved Trump in order to lead the United States. We saw Jesus is Lord and Jesus is King become a campaign slogan that was shouted at rallies. I mean, how disgusting is that, to take the central confession of our faith, that Jesus is Lord, and to use it as a campaign slogan in service of a political figure. So all of that was at work, I believe, to try to motivate a particular part of the electorate to vote for Trump. And so we know that that had some impact on the eventual outcome.
Yeah. In your book, I was paying attention to the sorts of challenges that congregations have to grapple with. And you mentioned that congregations need to look at how they use supremacist language without, being mindful of the power of it, and how congregations, largely white congregations, have to deal with racism and learning about how to be anti-racist populations. And how do we do that work? And to whom do we turn? I want you to give me the answer, please. Because it's a huge, I was really grateful that you named those two things and strongly aware that that's our work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the book's this big, right? So I can't cover all of how to dismantle white supremacy from Christianity in this book, but I do think, and there is a great resources section where I point to a lot of other books that can be very helpful for congregations. But the point that I'm trying to make in the book is that I think something that some of the conversation around Christian nationalism gets wrong is thinking that this is a problem that's just a problem for a certain part of the American public. And sometimes we hear it in the way that even the language of Christian nationalist, like, oh, the Christian nationalists won this election for Trump or something like that. Well, I think we need a whole new vocabulary. And so instead of labeling anyone as a Christian nationalist, I talk about Christian nationalism as an ideology that every single one of us have opportunities every single day to either embrace or reject. And that gives us all space to examine how we ourselves have been complicit, either by our action or even more by our inaction sometimes, in working to dismantle it. And so I think that it's really important, particularly for people who are in church communities, to have these hard conversations within the context of the church community. And part of what we can do is really examine and think about how have our theologies, how have our worship practices, how have the liturgies, how are the songs that we're singing, how have these all kind of accepted into them some of the ideology of Christian nationalism without us even thinking about it? For instance, I was guest preaching at my church recently, and I was preaching out of the lectionary, as I always do, and the passage was the passage from Ephesians on the armor of God. Which is one of the passages that is the most misused and misinterpreted, I think, by those who are embracing Christian nationalism. But I preached a different interpretation of that scripture, one that I think is more faithful to the way that Paul was writing. But then I was working with the worship leader, and he said, well, where are you going so I can know what songs to pick? And I said, please, no Onward Christian Soldiers.
Yeah.
And he's a thoughtful person. He wouldn't have picked that, but I just thought, if I don't say it, if I open the bulletin. But even the fact that hymn is in our hymnal.
Yes.
Right? We're using the language of empire in our sacred music. And we sometimes haven't interrogated why that is, or what violence has been done in the name of Christ for centuries. And that if we don't examine and think differently about how we talk about what it means to be a Christian now, that our theologies can continue to be distorted and misused in our present day.
Yeah.
And so the work, and because, speaking to racism and white supremacy, I learned a lot writing this book. And one of the things is your first outline is not what the finished book looks like. And so my outline, I had a separate chapter that was all about white Christian nationalism and how Christian nationalism overlaps with white supremacy. And when you look at the book, you're not going to see that chapter here. It's not because I didn't think that it was an important point. It just couldn't be cabined off into one chapter. So instead, the entire book talks about how white supremacy and Christian nationalism are completely intertwined. And so I think our work as Christians, and particularly white Christians, is thinking how we have absorbed these messages of white supremacy in our own thinking about what it means to be Christian, in ways that we have not, I think, really dealt with as white Christians in church. And to have those brave conversations need to happen right now.
I appreciated that rather than externalize and put it on someone else, you encouraged me anyway as a pastoral leader to always, and I do anyhow, but how do we examine the things that we do, and how do we hold to the strength of that which is good and right and faithful and justice seeking, and how do we find ground in the midst of that hard work? How do we find the courage? You had a good Bonhoeffer piece in there that I don't know if you're willing to share that. But it's delicious and helpful. And I don't know if you want to share it now or later or at some other time. But how do we do this work rather than expect the world around us to understand, the cogency of our argument? It's too easy, I think, to be frustrated with those people who did that sort of choosing at the voting booth. Yeah. But how do we do the work that is only ours to do, I guess?
Yeah. Well, in the book, the chapters are written as steps. So, and the idea being that here are ways that we can kind of walk through an ethic of action. And step 2 is called Ground Ourselves in God's Love. And it's really an invitation to return to the heart of our faith, of what it really means to be Christian, because our theology has been so distorted through the centuries by Christian nationalism. And there was a piece, and I do think that Bonhoeffer needs to be reread now.
Yes.
In light of the moment that we're in. I've been thinking and talking this week, and I agree with others who have said that the moment we're in is very much like Germany 1933. We have just elected, through a free and fair election, a leader who has authoritarian designs on the country. And what we do and how we respond as an American people, but also as Christian communities, will have dire implications for our country, for our neighbors, and history will judge us for it. And so I think to look to how other Christian dissenters in the past have responded to moments like these are really important for us. And what I think is critical we not do in this moment is given to a politics of despair. That we don't become so defeated by what happened on Tuesday that we give up and think, what can we do in this moment? And so I wanted to read from that chapter just briefly, because I think it speaks to what a lot of people are feeling right now. And I spoke, I actually am quoting here from a conversation that I had with Walter Brueggemann, the Old Testament scholar, particularly of the Hebrew prophets. And I talked with him about Christian nationalism for a podcast series I did in 2019 called The Dangers of Christian Nationalism. And I included some of what he said to me in that conversation in the book, and it's so relevant to our current time. So I wanted to read a little bit, and it's mostly of Dr. Brueggemann. So from the book, the merging of religious and political identity and Christian nationalism, quote, makes God a captive and domesticates God, said Brueggemann. When God is domesticated, it really leaves us without hope. What's going on in US politics, it is essentially a politics of despair, in which we believe that nothing radically good can happen, and therefore it is a scramble to get as many of the marbles in our pocket before the game ends. But that's a no-win strategy because in the long run, it diminishes everyone's life, those who are on top of the heap and those who are underneath them. I was struck at the time by Dr. Brueggemann's profound observation of our political life and the role that faith plays and could play if we were to dismantle Christian nationalism. By merging the almighty power of God with the earthly power of the state, we reduce the sacred to the secular. We turn God into a mascot for the state. And then this is Brueggemann again. Empires and monopolies of power generally depend on very anemic gods who do not do anything except smile and bless, like God bless America. And obviously, the God to whom the prophets bear witness is not an anemic God. Dr. Brueggemann pointed out that the status quo prefers gods that do nothing but legitimate the way things are. He said, so it really is a God, capital G God, versus lowercase g God issue. A robust, true God versus false, anemic gods, he said, noting that those issues can immediately descend into political and economic matters. And then this, I think, is so important. Here's a theological word for resistance. He noted that Good Friday, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ by state authorities, was the pinnacle of power of the Roman Empire. And the resurrection of Christ on Easter Sunday shows that earthly power was superseded by God's power. Brueggemann said, and what the crucifixion-resurrection narrative bears witness to is that the presumption of any nation or any empire has its limits and finally cannot defeat God's intention for an alternative way in the world. So I see the confession of Easter as being pivotal for political practice in the world because it says that God's will for life and for well-being finally is the truth of the world. And when we sign on for that, we sign on for all kinds of possibilities that the nation or the empire does not want to entertain.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brueggemann.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
and for the conversation. That's
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah.
So as you are building this network with other organizations too, where are you finding life?
There is a vast group of organizations and individuals who care deeply about this issue. I mean, you all have started to amass and organize here in Minnesota, but I see this kind of energy all over the country. And I've been working, and in my acknowledgments, I have a long list of all of the different advocates and scholars and journalists that have been doing the work alongside, that we've been working alongside for just years now. And And so I'm finding life both in Christian communities, but also in interfaith communities and in secular communities. Jerry mentioned that we first met in person at the Freedom from Religion Foundation conference, which is a group for atheists and agnostics and humanists and all non-religious people who are committed to the separation of church and state. And I was there to receive their First Amendment Award for the work that we did together to report on Christian nationalism and its impact on January 6th and its threat to American democracy. So I see energy and hope in the way that we are uniting across all kinds of lines of difference, including a difference of belief, in defense of a pluralistic democracy. Yeah. And even more than that, in defense of this foundational American value that has never been fully realized, but a promise of the US Constitution that we all belong, regardless of what we believe or how we worship or how we identify religiously, or even if we're religious or not. That idea of equal belonging in American society without regard to religion, that we can have a large coalition of people who are committed to that, and that this work, trust me, this is not a silver lining. This is just a reality. That we are being forced to the precipice of authoritarianism right now, and this moment can bring us together to pull the country back. Yeah. And as we go back, we're not going back to something that we've never had before. We are actually creating the pluralistic democracy that's never been.
We could turn the page.
Yes.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, truth.
But and no false promise here. This isn't, we're not going to be sitting here in a year celebrating we've arrived.
No, it's hard work.
It's hard work.
Yeah.
And I say in the very beginning of the book, this will not be accomplished, there's not false advertising. It's called How to End Christian Nationalism, but I say in the introduction, it's not going to happen in your lifetime or mine. Mm-hmm. That's because it's been brewing for centuries.
Yeah. Yeah.
But what we can do in your lifetime and mine is get on the road to starting to end it.
And it seems, I don't know how many people of a different generation, like my children's age, who are in their 30s, it feels to me like Christians need to organize in such a way that the generations to come understand that we are advocating for a fully inclusive world. So the challenge of trying to convince my kids, who have only heard me preach and their stepdad, that Christians are not like that.
Right.
And they know
what
I stand for. But they believe what the public says Christians believe.
Yeah.
Which is heartbreaking.
It is, and I think you're getting to kind of one of these drivers of Christian nationalism, actually, right? That the idea that many Christian communities in this country are worshiping a false idol of power and not following Jesus. Mm-hmm. And people, particularly younger people, see the hypocrisy.
Yep.
They can read the Gospels and see that what they're being told as Christianity has nothing to do with the teachings of Jesus, has nothing to do with the crucifixion, resurrection story that we talked about. So they understand the hypocrisy. They don't want anything to do with it.
Yeah.
But then those who are embracing Christian nationalism out of their own sense of fear, decline, and loss, in a desperate attempt to hold on to societal power, are using their power to try to force their religious beliefs on everyone else.
Yep.
And not only is this disastrous for religious freedom, but it will also be disastrous for their aims, because we can look both back to history and around the world today and see that countries that have established religion, that the actual rates of observance of that established religion are lower in countries that don't have established religion. Yeah. So if they really want to It sounds kind of biblical, right? If you want to save Christianity, you actually have to let it freely flourish and allow people to choose it for themselves.
Yeah, beautiful. We have some questions that people submitted before this night. Yes. This is a good one. What's the relation of patriarchy and Christian nationalism?
Oh, wow.
Go, you go.
We could have had a whole session on that topic. And I saw Angela Dinkins here. She could come up and give the lecture on Christian nationalism and patriarchy. There is overlap with Christian nationalism in a lot of different ideologies. And I think the piece that's patriarchy is that Christian nationalism tends to reinforce, again, a fundamentalist reading of the Bible that has very strict gender roles. It also relies on this mythological history of the United States as a quote-unquote Christian nation. And in doing so, it idealizes the founding period. The founding period that was not an idyllic time for most people, including women, right? But also including indigenous communities, including enslaved populations, including people who were poor, including non-religious, and non-Christian communities. So all of these communities were left out of full citizenship rights at the beginning. And Christian nationalism tells the story that that's the way it actually should be, that God ordained that structure for this country. And that reinforces this sense that we have somehow drifted away from God's vision for the United States by giving citizenship rights to all of these other groups. And there are actually, I've been saying this for a long time and understanding that that's the story that was being told, but in the lead up to the election, I actually saw some Christian leaders on their podcasts that lots of people listen to, making the argument that we should go back and only have voter enfranchisement for men who hold property and who have children.
Wow.
People are making this argument. Right, so this idea of taking away the rights of women is part and parcel. And we see it in the way that policies are being promulgated, in the wake of the Dobbs decision in a post-Roe world, where for the first time we actually see rights being taken away, constitutional rights being taken away by the US Supreme Court. And then when that becomes a quote-unquote states' rights issue, we are living in a country where half the people, where basically your rights as a woman are determined by your zip code and your geography. And that is all tied up with this ideology of Christian nationalism, with a very particular reading of Christian scriptures about human sexuality and reproductive freedom that is being imposed on everyone else.
Thank you. All right, Jerry's on his way. Thank you.
Teacher Bonhoeffer, we got two questions on Teacher Bonhoeffer.
Okay, all righty, thanks, Jerry. This was a previously submitted question. Legally, could there be a future in the U.S. where churches could be discriminated against or fined or worse for not complying with or cooperating with the presidential administration? If not, do you think the incoming administration could do it anyway and assume that they would get away with it?
Yes, unfortunately. So I'll just, this is my, this is the primary work of the Baptist Joint Committee, is understanding religious freedom and the separation of church and state, and how our laws, including the U.S. Constitution, protect religious freedom. And of course, the Constitution itself, a secular document, religious freedom protected in the First Amendment with two guarantees, a guarantee of no establishment of religion and a guarantee of the free exercise of religion. And those two promises together constitute religious freedom. The problem is that the First Amendment has been reinterpreted by the current US Supreme Court in ways that have really eroded the understanding of the separation of the institutions of religion and government, elevating free exercise claims, almost always by Christians, while de-emphasizing or really negating in most situations the idea of a no establishment by government. And this has created opportunities for theocracy, right? If you say that government can establish religion, and then you are also having an interpretation of the free exercise clause that really benefits Christians in most places, then you're out of whack when you're thinking about how we protect religious freedom for all people in this country without having the government either promote or denigrate any one religion over another or religion over irreligion. And so while under the current system, we do have a place where we have independent religious organizations, if you start messing with that balance, we could get to a situation where we do have churches coming under state control. And in an authoritarian system, that is really necessary because the idea of separate institutions of religion and government, that is a protection for pluralistic democracy. It both protects the rights of all people, but it also protects people even in the majority religion because it gives our religious institutions the necessary independence and separation from the control of the state in order to speak truth to power. But in a country that starts assuming the religion for its own, we could see that a dissenting church or a dissenting tradition that is coming at odds with the government and power could then come under that government's control. And I will say that one policy that I think we should definitely be watching out for was something that the first Trump administration tried and failed to do. And that was to repeal what's called the Johnson Amendment. The Johnson Amendment is a piece of tax law that says that 501c3 organizations, which include houses of worship, but also include the entire charitable sector, that in exchange for their most favored tax status, that they will not endorse candidates or otherwise intervene in political campaigns for public office. And this provision protects the independence of houses of worship from government control. And if it were taken away, then we could see tremendous pressure from political campaigns of all persuasions to try to have the endorsement, but also the financial support of churches. And that will tear down the independence of the religious sector from the government in ways that, again, this happens kind of piece by piece. But I think that could be a piece that could be down the road where we're sacrificing the independent voice of religious organizations.
There's a follow-up, not really, but sort of. In your estimation, what proportion of non-denominational megachurches are supportive of or are preaching a Christian nationalist doctrine?
Yeah, I don't know like figures or percentages, but I will say there's quite a bit of public polling and out there from organizations like PRRI is probably the leading organization that's been doing up-to-date surveys on how prevalent Christian nationalism is. And they chart, Christian nationalism is not a diagnosis. It's not something you either have or you don't. It's an orientation, right? And so all these polls are just a snapshot in time. It's how the people who are responding to questions in that moment. And at one end, the people who are most embracing Christian nationalism are called adherents, and those at the other end who are most rejecting it are called rejectors. And they find that you have rejectors and adherents and everything in between, the resistors and the accommodators. You have all of those people in every community, right? In every religious denomination, every ethnic group, and every racial group. So it's not something that is just one segment of the society. But among white evangelical spaces, many of which probably would fall into this non-denominational category, that's where you have the highest rates of adherence to Christian nationalism. Doesn't mean that it's not present in mainline spaces, it's not present in all these other groups, but the highest instance is in white evangelical spaces. And I think that is one of the explanations why, yet again, over 80% of white evangelicals voted for Trump. There is a correlation between embracing Christian nationalism and voting for this particular candidate.
Well, and labels are really tricky too. So there's a question from an American Baptist, but it could be from a United Methodist or a Presbyterian. This person writes, I'm an American Baptist in a progressive Baptist church, but when I visited my cousin's ABC church in Iowa 6 years ago, they began the service with the Pledge of Allegiance. I was shocked. Where did we Baptists lose our way? And it could be United Methodists, or it could be any other denomination, or how do we unpack who we think we are, regardless of what the label on our door says?
Yeah.
It's tricky. How do we know when we walk into a place? The Pledge of Allegiance might be a tip-off.
I have so many questions about this question.
Yeah, sorry.
But
yeah, I bet you want to know, where is that church?
Well, and I'm going to assume, I'm going to be charitable and assume that it was like the 4th of July or it was Veterans Day. Well, you laugh, but like I grew up in a Baptist church that had a God and Country dinner the Wednesday night that was closest to the 4th of July. And even as a kid, it really made my skin crawl, I will tell you. But it was something that was important to this community. It was a way to celebrate the veterans and the sacrifice in that community. I believe there are other ways to celebrate the veterans and the sacrifice in the community in ways that don't merge our American and Christian identities in our religious spaces. And I think that there are a lot of congregations that are wanting to honor the people in their communities, but are doing so with a theology of American patriotism, a theology of nationalism, and that's the kind of work that we could really interrogate. You know, I haven't been in many churches that start the service with the Pledge of Allegiance. I've been in a lot of churches that have an American flag on their chancel, and it's the same thing. It sends a signal. What are we worshiping here? What are we about in this place? And that symbol of American power, how free are we really to criticize the actions of our government when they come into conflict with the teachings of Jesus?
Yeah.
Because the actions of our government come into conflict with the teachings of Jesus all the time.
Well, and it's the role of the prophets to question that.
That's right.
Yeah.
And there is something about the patriotic symbols in our worship spaces that can silence the prophetic imagination and the prophetic voice.
Yes. There are a number of questions about the new Bonhoeffer movie, some are encouraging us to get tickets, and the other is saying that maybe perhaps we should examine the perspective of the person who made this movie. Do you have any wisdom about that for those of us who love his work and his heart? But what of this new piece? Have you encountered it?
I have not seen it. I understand that the film is based on the book by Eric Maxis.
Yes.
Who is an ardent proponent of Christian nationalism.
I know, it's tragic.
and is himself fascinated with Bonhoeffer. I don't know how he reconciles those two things. I think it will have an impact on the way that the film is portrayed. And so I would caution, I will want to see something before I criticize it, but just knowing the source of it, I would go with a critical lens. And if there are things in it that don't ring true, because I bet there are a lot of Bonhoeffer scholars in this room, to call those things out. I know that the Bonhoeffer family, I don't think it's the film, but has called out the way that Eric Maxis has used Bonhoeffer in the way that he talks, that the family has distanced themselves from him. And so I would rely on other scholars of Bonhoeffer and those to call attention away from the film.
Yeah. So a hermeneutics of suspicion.
Yes.
Yes. This question pierces my heart and is real. I'm transmasculine, Black, and scared. Do you think we will go back to the days of slavery? Will it be safe to be queer anymore?
If the people in this room and rooms like this don't stand up for our neighbors, it will not be in this country.
Yeah.
And that makes me so sad to say, and it makes me scared and anxious for our neighbors, but it's the truth. If we don't stand up, who will?
Yeah.
And the fear-mongering, the hatred, the misunderstanding, you know, I watch a lot of college sports, and I watch them with my 9-year-old son. And in Texas, we didn't have a competitive presidential race, but there was what we thought would be a competitive Senate race.
You thought.
And Ted Cruz had these ads that were targeting transgender people on all the time. And my son was like, is this true? You know, and then I had to explain how that it was not true and how he was using this misunderstanding of people in order to scare people.
Yeah.
In ways that are dehumanizing. A colleague of mine who is a Black woman told me that she had friends who received a text that said they were to report for slavery.
I read about that.
And I think what is happening in this country is a terrorism.
Yeah.
It is meant to terrify and scare people into submission. And it's meant to terrify the people who are the targets, but it's also aimed at terrifying us into being scared to stand up.
Yeah.
And I'll speak for myself. A cisgender woman who is a Christian, who is well-educated, I cannot be scared in this moment.
No.
And I have to stand up for what is right for every vulnerable person in this country.
Amen. Amen.
And so do we all.
Yeah.
And I just as a person, I think this is what we have to do. But as a Christian, this is what our faith commands us to do.
Yeah.
Is to love our neighbor.
Yes.
And this is how we love our neighbor in this moment.
Mm-hmm. This is along the same lines. There are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer folks who are scared about the next 4 years. From securing the future of their families to accessing the health care they need, at the heart of these barriers lies the tenets of Christian nationalism. You propose that Christians must do the work of dismantling Christian nationalism but many Christians don't believe in the full inclusion of queer folk in the church. So how do you see a way forward for these two groups, queer folk and Christians, to work together to dismantle Christian nationalism?
Boy, that's a tough question.
Yeah.
And I'm still grappling with all of this, because on the one hand, and I'll just tell you, I'm like grappling real time with this question. On the one hand, I believe in religious freedom.
Yeah.
And I believe in every person's ability and responsibility to interpret the divine for themselves. And so to that end, I defend different churches' decisions on how they interpret the gospel and on whom they include in their religious spaces, right? Mm-hmm. And whom they don't include. Even when I don't agree with them, especially when I don't agree with them, because that's the heart of religious freedom.
Right.
But they don't have a right to do that for our government, right? Mm-hmm. And so I will continue to defend people's right to decide how they organize religiously, but they don't get to impose those rules on who belongs in our country. And the work that we do to protect religious pluralism in this country and to protect a pluralistic democracy, I think needs to include people who interpret the scriptures in different ways, who understand God in different ways, that we don't have to insist on a uniformity of understanding, even if it's our own understanding, in order to live peaceably together. But what we can't do, what we must insist upon, is that not one person's given theological belief be imposed on everyone else through law and policy. Mm-hmm. And that's where we can draw the line between those two things. I can disagree with an interpretation of the gospel that would exclude. Mm-hmm. I don't understand a God who doesn't love and include everyone. I just don't, it doesn't compute for me. Mm-hmm. But I can respect the religious freedom for people to understand scripture differently than I do.
So there are places and locations where the queer community and the Christian community can come together in advocacy.
Oh, and there are Christians. Oh, thank you. There are lots of Christians who are fully accepting of the queer community.
Oh, yes, there are.
Lots of Christian communities are. Mm-hmm. Many.
Yeah.
The community that I worship in, the community that we're sitting in right now, right? There are lots of communities that are fully inclusive. I guess I'm just saying that I think we could build a coalition even with Christians who aren't as inclusive in their religious spaces, as long as they understand that religious belief doesn't need to be imposed on everyone else through our laws and policies.
Yep, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Thank you. This question says, I have friends who are non-Christians. How can they take actions to block the influence of Christian nationalists? And how do we partner with non-Christians?
Oh, I think it's crucial that we partner with people from other faith traditions and with non-Christians and non-religious, atheists, agnostics, humanists, the entire gamut. That I think all of our organizing spaces, when I say multi-faith, I am including secular allies in that definition. We need better language for that, right? But that we include, everything, every orientation towards faith and away from faith in the organizing that we do. I think we have different roles, though, and I actually talked to a few different people from the secular community in the book, including Representative Jared Huffman, who is the only openly non-religious member of Congress. I love that. He says, I'm the only one who's out about being non-religious. He says there are other colleagues that, which is a whole nother conversation, because even though there's a part of our Constitution says there's no religious test for public office, so many people still think that they have to to profess a Christian identity in order to be elected in this country. So that's not really religious freedom, and that's not really no religious test for public office. But he is also the first member of Congress to make a floor speech against Christian nationalism.
Oh.
It's often our secular allies who are out front on calling out the dangers of Christian nationalism and the dangers of authoritarian theocracy, because they understand what's at stake. At the same time, they are exposed then for being labeled as anti-Christian. And so it's critical, and that's why we've done work together, it's critical for the Christian community in particular to normalize speaking out against Christian nationalism, because it becomes harder and harder to dismiss all of us as falling outside the faith or being anti-Christian if we're all speaking out against Christian nationalism.
Beautiful. This is sort of a follow-up. This person says, I'm the lead pastor of a fairly large progressive Lutheran church, and I'm fortunate that my congregation is eager to learn about this through books and sermons and speakers. But how can we, as Christian public leaders, help to bring light and clarity around Christian national theology beyond the walls of our own congregations, especially to those who aren't in spaces to learn about it? You mentioned in your book that the way forward is through the theology. Mm-hmm. So how do we be public theologians without our pulpits outside of our buildings? And we're all theologians, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the realistic news is you're about to have a lot of opportunities to do just that.
Thank you.
And this is the difference between Christian nationalism and faith-based advocacy, right? The difference between Christian nationalism and faith-based advocacy, that the separation of church and state has never meant the separation of religion from the public square.
That's right.
And so it is vital for those of us who do come at this from a Christian perspective that we bring our Christian witness and our Christian vocabulary and our understanding, our theology, into political practice in the world, and that we not shy away from using that theological language in our public advocacy, even in our testimonies, not just religious testimonies, but in our testimonies before Congress, or before the city council, or before your state legislature, in public actions, in just all of the ways that we will have a chance to go to our school board and talk. Now, the important thing, though, is that we not cross the line into Christian nationalism, which is saying my beliefs should be reflected in law and policy, right? I'm here from my particular perspective, but I'm advocating for everyone, right? So there's a difference that can sometimes be subtle, and so we need to practice this in communities and in our public action. And I talk about this quite a bit in the book, giving examples of faith-based advocacy and Christian nationalism and the difference between the two.
Thank you. I'm told I have time for two more. Jerry says only two. How do you keep church from... I can't read it. Have you had direct conversations or debates with Christian nationalists? And I love this part. How'd that go?
So I'm not going to be too picky, but I don't label anybody a Christian nationalist.
No.
Not really, I will tell you. And here's the deal. I think I get a version of this question quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I think there's so much more work to do with the people who are accommodating or just resisting Christian nationalism. That group of people, by the way, is the largest segment of the US population. Like 60% of us are somewhere in the middle. And I want to work on that 60% before I go to the hardcore ambassadors of Christian nationalism. Because, and like how'd that go? I think, and I do write about this, I think we have to be realistic about how we approach any conversation. And and first, like even the idea of having a debate, I think we need to have a conversation. And we need to do so with someone that we're already in relationship with. And that conversation needs to be one of genuine curiosity and listening posture. Kind of back to where we started. If the election results tell us that the country and the way things are going are not working for people, can we listen with curiosity about why people voted the way they did? What they think should be different? How can we work together on policy solutions that work for all of us? That can move us forward, rather than trying to go into a conversation saying, if I just have the right talking points and the right data, I'm gonna change this person's mind in 52 minutes, right? But rather, how do I have a conversation that can lead to genuine transformation of not just the person I'm in relationship with, but for me as well? What am I really going to learn? How do I approach this conversation, this relationship with a genuine openness to learning about a fellow child of God? And how can we emerge from this as changed people, even if it's just a little bit at a time?
Thank you. Is there anything I didn't ask you that you wish I had? Anything you want to share that certainly my awareness grew around? We had talked here in church about who is my neighbor, and loving our neighbors ourselves. And that was big before the election. And what I realized after the election is I don't know my neighbors because I live in this little bubble.
Yep.
Or maybe bigger bubble, but I don't know the people exactly as you're saying. I'm not in relationship with people who voted.
Yeah, and you're not alone.
No.
Right, and I think that's a piece. I've really been thinking a lot about how we are all still traumatized by living through the pandemic.
Yes.
And how that trauma separated us from each other and in some ways from our own humanity. And that we are all still figuring out how to return to a more human way of life again. And technology and the people who make money off that technology and the people who sell us things based on what we click on and what we like, they have a vested interest against us having conversations that we're talking about having here. And so I guess as we end and segue to the next part, I think what's so crucial about this work is actually getting to know our neighbor.
Yes.
And doing it in coalitions for organizing in our local community. Yeah. This event and the events like it that I'm having around the country, one of the goals is that you will meet your neighbors who care about this issue as much as you do and find ways to work together. And after November 5th, we have a lot of work to do.
Yes.
And through the work that we do, we will not only build the kind of society that we need, but we will actually get to know our neighbor and build relationships. And that is a win and a good in and of itself. And that is that's what will get us out of this hole that we've dug ourselves into. And I think is so crucial for what's to come.
Thank you. And thank you for the work you're doing and the heart and the wisdom and the advocacy. And it's wonderful to be able to claim faith in the public square. So thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joy Pettigrew, and I'm with BJC as our Community Partnerships Manager, and I am so enriched by this conversation today. One of the things that Amanda talked about and our community talked about is the need to protect our neighbors and the most vulnerable around us. And so as we gather, as we organize, we learn, we engage, we educate, and a really key piece is also to act, to stand in solidarity. And so I'm here to announce a call to action that is one way that we can do that with those who are most directly impacted by Christian nationalism. One of those communities are immigrant communities. As we know, so much language and rhetoric around Christian nationalism, as this rhetoric talks about who belongs and who doesn't belong, our vulnerable immigrant communities are very impacted. And so one legislative bill that will be reintroduced this next legislative session is called the North Star Act. And this is a bill that's being proposed that would ensure that local and state government and resources are not used for civil immigration enforcement. And so what this policy does is it protects immigrants and ensures that there's public safety for all Minnesotans. One thing that you might know if you work with vulnerable immigrant communities is that immigrant communities tend to do a lot of things under the radar. They don't report crimes or seek emergency services out of fear of law enforcement also becoming immigrant enforcement. And so because of that, immigrants are often the victims of crimes that go unreported, and this is a public safety issue for all Minnesotans. So this bill will be reintroduced, and there is a North Star Alliance group of a coalition of over 30 organizations here in Minnesota that are trying to push this forward. And so they're asking for two ways practically you can support. One is to support the bill as it comes up in this next legislative session. How you can do that, since it's not live yet, you can stay updated by going to northstaract.org. So North Star as in the North Star, and then ACT as in ACT.org. The second thing that you're being invited to do is this is something that you want to organize around, or you want to strategize on how can we mobilize our Christian communities to stand in solidarity with immigrant communities and the organizations that are frontline working on this together. We'd love to know who you are. We have a sign-up sheet outside in the foyer by the Christians Against Christian Nationalism sign, and you can sign your name and email, and we'll follow up with you about ways that we can collaborate together on that. So those are two ways, northstaract.org, or sign up and partner with us in that. The second thing, we mentioned our queer LGBTQ plus communities being very vulnerable as well. Matt from Outfront Minnesota is here and setting up a table. Matt, are you here? Matt, right there. He'll be setting up a table. He's a director of organizing of Outfront Minnesota, and their goal and mission is to build power with Minnesota's LGBTQ plus communities and address inequalities through different forms of advocacy and organizing. So he'll be there talking about how to get involved and connect as well. So let's not despair, but find hope in the ways that we listen to those who are directly impacted and stand alongside and organize together. So I'm very encouraged by you all and for everything that you're doing and for Jerry's leadership. So thank you.
Thank you. Are we done? I think we're done.